A routine traffic stop on a quiet suburban evening takes a dark turn when Officer Jamal Carter notices something off a little girl in the back seat, clutching her doll too tightly, her eyes silently pleading what should have been a simple warning spirals into a race against time to uncover a sinister truth. The night was unusually quiet as Officer Jamal Carter cruised down the suburban streets. The hum of the patrol car's engine and the occasional crackle of his radio were the only sounds breaking the stillness. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 8:43 p.m. It had been an uneventful shift, the kind that lulled officers into a sense of routine monotony. But Jamal knew better than to relax. Quiet nights often had a way of revealing their own troubles. His headlights caught a movement at an upcoming intersection. An old sedan rolled through a stop sign, the driver either oblivious to or deliberately ignoring the law. Jamal sighed, flipping on his lights. It wasn't a major offense, but a stop sign was a stop sign, and he wasn't about to let it slide. The sedan slowed, then pulled over to the shoulder. Jamal parked behind it, his mind already running through the usual possibilities. Distracted driver, someone coming home late from work, maybe even a teenager testing their limits. He radioed into the stop, his voice calm and professional. Dispatch, this is Officer Carter. I'm pulling over a dark sedan, license plate 4A3X9. 192. Routine traffic stop. No assistance needed. As he stepped out of the car, the cool night air greeted him. His boots crunched against the pavement as he approached the driver's side window. He carried himself with the practiced ease of years on the force, but his senses were sharp, scanning the vehicle for anything out of place. The window rolled down smoothly, and Jamal was met with the smiling face of a man who seemed a little too polished for the hour. He looked to be in his late 40s, with neatly combed hair, a button-down shirt, and an air of forced calmness. Good evening, officer, the man said, his voice warm and measured, as if rehearsed. Something wrong? Jamal glanced inside the car. In the back seat, a little girl sat clutching a doll to her chest. She looked no older than 7, her blonde hair falling in loose waves around her pale face. Her small frame seemed stiff, her posture rigid, as if she were trying to disappear into the seat. She offered Jamal a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Evening, Jamal said, his tone neutral. You ran a stop sign back there. Any reason for the rush? The man chuckled nervously. Oh, my apologies, it's late. And I guess I wasn't paying enough attention, just trying to get home. Jamal nodded, keeping his eyes on the man's license and registration. Please. The man reached into the glove compartment without hesitation, pulling out the requested documents and handing them over. Nom Stephen Blake, he said smoothly. And this here is my daughter, Emily. We've been at my sister's place for a late family dinner. Emily's pretty wiped out, as you can see. Emily's head bobbed slightly as if to agree, but her movements felt unnatural, almost robotic. Jamal noticed how her hands gripped the doll tightly, her knuckles white. When Stephen glanced back at her, Jamal caught a subtle flinch in the girl's body, barely perceptible, but enough to set off alarm bells in his mind. Emily, hud, Jamal said, addressing the girl directly. You doing okay back there? Her smile faltered for a split second before she nodded. Yes, sir, she whispered, her voice almost too quiet to hear Stephen, and quickly, she's just tired. Long night, you know how it is. Jamal's eyes flicked back to the man where his home just outside of town. Stephen replied without missing a beat, near Meadowbrook Lane. The response was quick, too quick. Jamal studied Stephen's face for a moment, noting the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cool night air. He then glanced down at the license and registration. Everything checked out. Stephen Blake, Meadowbrook Lane, registered to the vehicle. Still something didn't sit right. The girl's smile seemed rehearsed, her movements stilted, her gaze never met his, instead darting nervously around the car. When Stephen's hand rested lightly on her shoulder, as if to reassure her, Jamal noticed how she subtly recoiled, shrinking away ever so slightly. You seem like a nice family man, Mr. Blake, Jamal said, testing the waters. It's not often I see a father and daughter out this late. Stephen chuckled again, the sound hollow. Yeah, well, it's not every day we have a dinner that runs this late, but family is important, you know. Jamal forced a polite nod, but kept his tone measured. Of course. Just a heads up, though, make sure you come to a full stop at signs. It's for everyone's safety. Stephen nodded quickly. Absolutely, officer. Won't happen again. Jamal stepped back from the car, still uneasy. He wanted to press further, but without any clear reason to detain them. He knew he couldn't justify holding them. All right, you're good to go. Drive safe. Thank you, officer. You have a good night, Stephen replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. As the car pulled away, Jamal watched it disappear into the darkness, his hand unconsciously resting on his holster. Something about the interaction glared at him, an instinct honed by years on the job, the man's overly polite demeanor, the girl's unsettling stillness. The slight flinch, none of it added up. He walked back to his cruiser, still thinking. Settling into the driver's seat, he pulled out his notebook and jotted down the license plate. The uneasy feeling in his chest wouldn't leave, and he wasn't one to ignore his gut. He stared at the empty road ahead, the quiet once again settling over the night, for now the car was gone, but the image of Emily clutching her doll lingered in his mind. Something wasn't right, Jamal just didn't know what, yet the precinct was quiet. When Jamal Carter returned, the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional ring of a phone filling the stillness, it was close to 9:30 p.m., and most of the night crew was either out on patrol or buried in paperwork. Jamal settled at his desk, but his mind wasn't on the reports piled in front of him. Instead, it kept drifting back to the interaction with Stephen Blake and the girl in the back seat. Something about it wouldn't let go. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as he replayed the scene in his mind, the man's polished demeanor to the girl's rigid posture, her pale face, and that faint smile that felt more like a mask than a genuine expression, the way she avoided eye contact, the way her fingers gripped the doll like a lifeline. It all felt wrong, but wrong wasn't enough to act on. Not yet. Jamal opened his notebook and flipped to the page where he jotted down the sedan's license plate. 4F3X992. He stared at it for a moment before typing it into the state database. As he waited for the system to process, he tapped his pen against the desk, the uneasy feeling in his chest growing stronger. The search results appeared on the screen, registered to Stephen Blake address Meadowbrook Lane, no prior arrests or citations on paper. Stephen was clean, just an average citizen. But Jamal knew that appearances could be deceiving. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. As he pulled up the dash cam footage for his patrol car, the grainy video played on the screen, showing the moment he approached the sedan. The man's face came into view, his forced smile almost too easy. Jamal fast-forwarded to the part where he spoke to Emily, pausing on her face. He couldn't shake the blankness in her eyes, the way they darted around like she was looking for an escape route. As Jamal studied the video, something caught his eye. He almost imperceptible, but there it was. Emily's lips moved as she clutched her doll. He replayed it several times, slowing the video to catch the exact moment her lips formed. Two words, "Help me." The realization hit Jamal like a punch to the gut. His heart pounded as he sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. She had tried to communicate, to reach out without drawing attention to herself. That faint whisper of desperation made everything click into place. This wasn't just a strange encounter. This was something far worse. He turned back to his computer and pulled up Stephen Blake's records again, this time digging deeper. He expanded the search to include other counties and states. As he scrolled through the results, a pattern began to emerge. Stephen's name popped up in several reports, none of which had led to charges. There were vague references to suspicious behavior around children, interviews in connection to missing minors, and even an anonymous tip claiming he was seen leaving a park with the child who later disappeared. Jamal's unease turned to cold dread. While there was no concrete evidence linking Stephen to any crimes, the pattern was clear. Wherever he went, children vanished. The room seemed to grow colder as Jamal opened a separate window and searched for recent Amber Alerts. His chest tightened when he found one that matched the description of the girl he'd just seen. Emily Harper, age 7, blonde hair, blue eyes, reported missing 3 days ago from a playground in Ridgefield, about 50 me from here. The report detailed how she had been playing with friends when she vanished. Witnesses described seeing a man in a dark sedan near the playground shortly before her disappearance. Jamal felt his pulse quicken as he leaned back in his chair. He stared at the screen, the pieces falling into place with horrifying clarity. Emily wasn't Stephen's daughter. She wasn't heading home after a family dinner. She was a missing child, and Stephen Blake was her abductor. He clenched his fists, anger rising alongside the panic. He'd let them go. He'd watched them drive away into the night. His instincts had been screaming at him, but he hadn't had enough to act on. Now a girl's life was on the line. Damn it, he muttered under his breath. Standing abruptly, he grabbed his radio and called dispatch. "This is Officer Carter. I need an APB on a dark sedan plate. 483X992 registered to Stephen Blake, possible abduction case. The child matches an active Amber Alert. Notify Ridgefield PD and coordinate immediately." The dispatcher's voice came through the radio comm, but alert copy that. Officer Carter sending out the bulletin Now stand by Jamal Pace's small corner of the precinct, his mind racing. He couldn't sit. And wait, he needed to do something. He pulled up a map of the area, tracing potential routes Stephen might take. Meadowbrook Lane was listed as his address, but Jamal doubted he'd go there if Stephen had been operating under the radar for this long. He wasn't stupid enough to lead the police to his doorstep. Jamal thought back to the stop, replaying every detail. Stephen had been calm, almost too calm. People who were hiding something often tried to overcompensate. And Emily, her silence, her subtle movements, those weren't the behaviors of a tired child. Those were the behaviors of someone terrified, someone trying not to provoke their capture. He sat back down and opened a new file, typing up a report on the traffic stop and attaching the dash cam footage. He flagged it for Detective Laura Mills' partner, and someone he trusted implicitly. She'd know how to coordinate with the Ridgefield task force. But even as he sent the email, he knew he couldn't wait for the wheels of bureaucracy to turn. He had to find them before it was too late. Jamal grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, his resolve hardening. He didn't know where Stephen was heading, but he was going to figure it out. He couldn't stop seeing Emily's face, her whispered plea for help. That image would haunt him until he brought her back safely. As he stepped out into the cool night air, his radio crackled. H again. Officer Carter, this is dispatch. Ridgefield PD confirms the Amber Alert. They're requesting coordination task force en route to Meadowbrook Lane to check the address. Copy that. Jamal said, already sliding into his cruiser. I'm heading out now. He turned the key, the engine roaring to life. The weight of what he uncovered pressed heavily on his shoulders, but he pushed it aside. There was no room for hesitation. Now a child's life depended on him. As he pulled out onto the street, his eyes scanned the empty roads ahead, every nerve on high alert. The quiet suburban streets that had seemed so ordinary earlier now felt like a maze, one he was determined to navigate before it was too late. He wasn't going to let Emily's faint cry for help go unanswered. Will Jamal stop Stephen and save Emily in time? Give this video a like if you're eager to find out, and comment where you're watching from. The wheels of Jamal Carter's cruiser rolled over the quiet streets as he dialed his partner's number, his grip on the steering wheel tighter than usual. The dispatch had already confirmed the Amber Alert matched the little girl he'd seen in the sedan. Every passing minute felt like an eternity, every second a step closer to Emily disappearing for good. Detective Mills. Sarah answered after the second ring, her tone brisk. As always, Sarah, it's me, Jamal, PA said, his voice clipped. We've got a situation. I stopped a sedan earlier tonight. Driver's name is Stephen Blake. In the back seat, there was a little girl, white blonde, around 7. Something fell off, but I let them go, just ran the plates and reviewed the footage. Turns out the girl matches an active Amber Alert, Emily Harper, missing out of Ridgefield 3 days ago. There was a brief silence on the other end before Sarah responded, her tone sharp. You're telling me you let her go? Jamal gritted his teeth on the weight of his earlier decision pressing down harder. Yeah, I didn't have anything solid to hold them on at the time, but now we know Stephen Blake has a record linked to child abductions, though nothing's ever stuck. He's our guy. Sarah let out a frustrated breath. Damn it, Jamal. All right, give me everything you've got on him. License plate, last known address, vehicle description. I'll loop in the Ridgefield task force. We need to move fast. I'm sending you the dash cam footage and my report now. Jamal said, his free hand already typing on his in-car laptop. Dispatch put out an APB, but I doubt he's headed back to the listed address. If he's smart, and he seems like he is, he's going to try to move her tonight. He knows the heat's coming. Sarah's voice hardened. Then we don't have time to wait. Let me pull up his file and see if there are any patterns. Does he have family, known associates, favorite places to hide? I'm digging into that now, Jamal replied. But this guy's slippery. He's been linked to similar cases across multiple states, but nothing's ever tied him down. He knows how to stay under the radar. Not for long, Sarah said firmly. Meet me at the precinct in 20. We'll map out a search plan and coordinate with Ridgefield. On my way, Jamal said, ending the call and flooring the gas back at the precinct. Tension filled the air as Jamal and Sarah poured over Stephen Blake's file. It was a frustrating mix of vague connections and near misses. Stephen had been questioned in multiple states, always in connection with missing children, but he had never been charged. He was slippery, methodical, and far too good at covering his tracks. He's got a pattern, Sarah said, scrolling through the file. He targets public spaces, parks, playgrounds, anywhere kids might takes them. But by the time authorities get close, he's already gone. Jamal leaned over her shoulder, his jaw tightening. He won't disappear this time. Not if we get to him first. Sarah glanced up at him, her expression unreadable. You're taking this personally. Damn right I am, Jamal said, his voice low but intense. I had her, Sarah She was right there in front of me, and I let her go, that's on me. I'm not letting him slip through my fingers again, Sarah sighed, softening her tone. Look, I get it, but beating your self-up won't help us find her. We need to stay focused. If he's planning to move her, we need to think like him. Where would he go? What's his next move? Jamal ran a hand over his face, trying to push down the frustration boiling inside him. If he's been at this for years, he's got a system. He doesn't take risks, which means he probably has a predetermined location. Somewhere secluded, somewhere he knows he won't be disturbed. Agreed, Sarah said, her fingers flying over the keyboard. She pulled up a map of the surrounding area, marking key points of interest. Let's start with the obvious. His listed address on Meadowbrook Lane is a long shot, but we'll have units check it anyway. Beyond that, we need to look at motels, rest stops, and any isolated properties. He might use. Jamal nodded, already scanning the map. What about Ridgefield? If he took her from there, he might still have a connection in the area. Good point, Sarah said. I'll loop in the Ridgefield PD and see if they've got any leads on associates or places he's known to frequent. Sarah's phone buzzed, and she read the message quickly. Ridgefield just flagged, an old hunting cabin about 30 miles out. It's owned by Stephen's uncle, but hasn't been used in years. Could be worth checking out. Jamal stood grabbing his jacket. I'll head there now. I'm coming with you, Sarah said, grabbing her car. Keys. The drive to the cabin was tense. The narrow, unpaved road leading to the property was overgrown with weeds, and the headlights barely cut through the darkness. The cabin came into view, a dilapidated wooden structure that looked as though it might collapse under its own weight. Jamal and Sarah parked their cars a distance away, approaching on foot with their flashlights. Scanning the area, the cabin's windows were boarded up, and the front door hung slightly ajar. Jamal's heart pounded as they stepped under the creaking porch. Dispatch, this is Detective Mills, Sarah said into her radio. We're at the location, proceeding with caution. Copy that, the dispatcher replied. Jamal pushed the door open, his flashlight cutting through the musty darkness. The inside was barren with dust-covered furniture and cobwebs in every corner. It was clear no one had been there in years. Nothing. Sarah muttered, her flashlight sweeping over the empty room. If he's got a system, he's already one step ahead. Jamal clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling up again. We're running out of time. Sarah nodded. We'll regroup. Let's focus on his last known movements. He might have stayed close to where you stopped him. People like him don't stray far from their comfort zones. Jamal's eyes narrowed as he thought back to the neighborhood where he first pulled Stephen over. Then, that's where we'll start. The neighborhood was eerily quiet as Jamal Carter parked his cruiser on the corner of the street where he had pulled over Stephen Blake. Just hours earlier, porch lights flickered weakly in the still night, casting faint halos. Onto the sidewalks Jamal stepped out of his car, his boots crunching on the gravel's shoulder. As he scanned the area, he'd let them go. He had looked Emily Harper in the eyes and let her disappear into the night with a man he now knew to be a predator. He wouldn't make that mistake again. He walked up the block, knocking on a few doors, hoping someone had seen something. Most residents were hesitant to answer at this late hour, their suspicion clear in the way they peered at him through cracked doors or windows. But finally, an older woman wrapped in a fleece robe cracked her door open just wide enough to see him. Sorry to bother you, ma'am. Jamal began holding up his badge. I'm Officer Carter. I'm investigating a missing child case and was wondering if you've seen a dark sedan in the area earlier tonight. White man driving, little girl in the back seat. The woman frowned, her brow creasing as she thought back. I think I did. It was parked right there. She pointed to the curb near her house. Didn't think much of it, but the driver kept looking around like he was checking if anyone was watching. Jamal's pulse quickened. Did you see which way they went? No, but the little girl in the back seat caught my eye. The woman continued. She looked scared, poor thing. I thought it was strange, but I didn't want to assume anything. Jamal nodded to confirmation, solidifying his growing dread. Thank you, ma'am. If you think of anything else, don't hesitate to call. He handed her his card before returning to his cruiser. His thoughts raced. Stephen wasn't just moving randomly. There was a calculated pattern to his stops. But why this neighborhood? What connection did he have here? As he climbed into his car, his radio crackled to life. Officer Carter, this is dispatch. We've received a tip from a diner waitress south of your location. She reports seeing a man matching Stephen Blake's description with a young girl earlier tonight. He appeared agitated, and the girl looked distressed. Jamal leaned forward, gripping the radio mic. What's the address? The Dispatcher relayed the location, a roadside diner, just off the highway not far from where Stephen had last been seen. Jamal punched the address into his GPS and hit the gas. The unease that had been gnawing at him since the traffic stop now burned like a fire in his chest. He was closing in, but every second felt like it stretched into hours. Jamal pulled into the gas station. He had stopped it earlier to retrace Stephen's steps. The fluorescent lights buzzed above the empty lot, casting stark shadows across the concrete. Inside, a young attendant was leaning on the counter, scrolling through his phone. Jamal walked in his badge, already in hand. Evening. He said, his tone brisk. "I'm Officer Carter. Need to ask you a few questions." The attendant straightened, shoving his phone into his pocket. "Sure, officer. What's this about?" "I'm looking for someone who might have passed through here earlier tonight." Jamal began, his voice steady. "Dark sedan, older model, white man, mid-40s, traveling with a little girl. About 7 years old, blonde hair." "Did you see them?" The attendant brow furrowed and thought, "Yeah, actually, they were here a few hours ago, maybe around 7. Or so." The guy filled up his tank, grabbed a couple of snacks. "The girl had this little doll. She was holding on to." "What about the man?" Jamal pressed, leaning closer. "Did he do or say anything unusual?" The young man hesitated, his face clouding with unease. "He seemed off, like he was in a hurry, but he was trying not to show it." The girl dropped her doll on the way out, and when she bent to pick it up, he snapped at her, called her stupid. She looked scared, but she didn't say anything, just grabbed the doll and got in the car. Jamal's stomach turned. He could see Emily's small trembling hands clutching the doll, her eyes avoiding his during the traffic stop. "Did you notice which direction they went?" "Yeah, they." "And Jamal jumped into his cruiser." "On my way," he replied, already pulling out of the lot. His hands gripped the wheel as he tore down the quiet streets. The diner was just a few miles south. Its location perfectly positioned for someone like Stephen, on the edge of town, close to the highway, but isolated enough to avoid attention. As Jamal approached, the diner's neon open 24-hour sign came into view, flickering faintly in the dark. He parked near the entrance, taking a deep breath as he scanned the parking lot for the dark sedan. There were only a few cars scattered across the lot, none of them matching Stephen's. Jamal stepped out of the cruiser's boots, crunching against the gravel. As he walked toward the door, his heart pounded in his chest, a mix of adrenaline and determination propelling him forward. The waitress inside had seen them. She might have the lead he needed to finally pin Stephen down. The bell above the diner door chimed softly as Jamal Carter stepped inside, the smell of coffee and fried food washing over him. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, illuminating the nearly empty space. Behind the counter, a middle-aged waitress with tired eyes and a name tag reading. Linda glanced up from wiping the counter. "You must be the officer," she said, straightening up. "I called about the man with the little girl." Jamal nodded, his focus razor sharp. "That's right, I'm Officer Carter. Tell me everything you saw." Linda set the rag down, folding her arms across her chest. "They came in maybe an hour or two ago." He ordered coffee and a burger, but the way he talked to the girl, it wasn't right. She looked scared, kept fidgeting with her doll. He snapped at her when she didn't sit still, told her to act normal. Poor thing didn't say a word the whole time, just sat there staring at her plate. Jamal's jaw tightened. Did he say anything that stood out where he might be heading? She nodded. "Yeah, he was on the phone at one point, said something about needing a place to stay for the night. There's a motel just down the highway, lakeside, and it's a real dump, but it's the closest place around." "Did he seem like he was in a hurry?" Jamal asked, his mind already racing ahead. Linda hesitated. "Not exactly, but he kept checking the door like he was paranoid. Someone was watching him." "Thank you," Jamal said, handing her his card. "If you remember anything else, give me a call." Linda nodded, her concern etched deeply into her face. "You find that girl okay?" She didn't look safe with him. Jamal tipped his head in acknowledgement and quickly exited the diner, his adrenaline spiking. Outside, he pulled out his radio and called. "Sarah, I've got a lead. Stephen might be holed up at the lakeside and off Highway 7. It's the closest motel." And the waitress said he mentioned needing a place to stay. "I'm already en route." Sarah replied, "I'll meet you there in 10. Jamal jumped into his cruiser and sped off, his sirens off to avoid drawing attention. The road stretched out before him, dark and empty save for the occasional car passing in the opposite direction. His hands gripped the wheel as he approached the motel, its neon sign flickering against the night sky like a failing heartbeat. The lakeside and was every bit as grimy as Linda had described. The parking lot was cracked and uneven with weeds poking through the asphalt. A few cars were scattered haphazard, their windows fogged up. The building itself was a single-story row of rooms with peeling paint and dim porch lights that barely illuminated the doorways. Jamal spotted Sarah's unmarked car near the far end of the lot. He parked beside her and got out, his heart pounding. As he approached her vehicle, she rolled down the window, her expression tense. I checked with the clerk. Sarah said Steven's car is here. He checked into room 12 about half an hour ago. Jamal's eyes darted to the far end of the row of rooms where a faint light seeped through the curtains of room 12. Do we know if the girl's with him? Sarah nodded grimly. The clerk said she was. She looked scared, but Steven brushed off. Said she was just tired. Jamal clenched his fist, the image of Emily's blank, terrified face flashing in his mind. We can't wait any longer. We need to move. Sarah placed a hand on his arm, her tone firm. Jamal, we have to be smart about this. If we go in guns blazing, he might panic. And do something to her. Let's stake it out. Wait for an opening. Reluctantly, Jamal nodded. They took up positions in the shadows across from the room, their eyes locked on the partially drawn curtains. Inside, Steven paced back and forth, his movements agitated and restless. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, clutching her doll tightly. Even from a distance, Jamal could see the tension in her small frame, the way her shoulders hunched as if trying to make herself invisible. The minutes dragged by, each one an eternity. As Jamal watched, Steven muttered to himself, his gestures growing more erratic. Jamal's patience wore thin, the thought of Emily in danger gnawing at him like a raw wound. Every fiber of his being screamed to act, but he forced himself to stay rooted in place. Finally, Steven grabbed a pack of cigarettes from the bedside table and stepped toward the door. Jamal's heart leapt. This is it, he whispered to Sarah. They watched as Steven stepped outside, a lit cigarette dangling from his lips. He stood on the small porch, oblivious to the officers hiding in the shadows. Jamal exchanged a glance with Sarah, who nodded now. She said Jamal moved quickly and silently, his feet crunching softly on the gravel. Steven didn't notice him until it was too late. Jamal grabbed him from behind, twisting his arm and forcing him to drop the cigarette. Steven let out a yelp of pain as Jamal pinned him against the wall. Stephen Blake, Jamal growled, you're under arrest for the abduction of Emily Harper. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Steven struggled, his voice a mixture of panic and anger. You've got it all wrong. She's my daughter. Save it, Sarah said, stepping forward and snapping a pair of handcuffs onto his wrist. We'll sort it out downtown. Steven spat on the ground, glaring at them with wild eyes. You don't know what you're doing. You're making a mistake. Ignoring his protest, Jamal hauled him toward the cruiser, leaving Sarah to secure the room. But before they could breathe a sigh of relief, a loud noise came from the woods behind the motel, a rustling that made Jamal freeze. What the hell was that? Sarah muttered, her hand instinctively moving to her weapon. Jamal turned sharply, scanning the tree line with narrowed eyes. Stay with him, I'll check it out. But before Jamal could take another step, Emily bolted out of the room, her small figure darting towards the woods. Emily, Jamal shouted, his voice cutting through the night. She didn't stop, her frantic movements blurred in the darkness, and within seconds she disappeared into the trees. Jamal's pulse surged with urgency, but before he could follow, something else caught his attention, a faint shadow moving along the edge of the woods. The forest loomed like a shadowy labyrinth as Jamal Carter plunged into its depths, flashlight in hand. The air was damp, carrying the earthy scent of wet leaves and soil. Branches clawed at his uniform, but he pressed on. The faint sound of Emily's cries spurring him forward. His breath came heavy and fast as heart. Someone else. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he realized he wasn't alone in these woods. Back at the motel, Sarah tightened her grip on Stephen Blake, who sneered at her despite his restrained hands. You think you've won, don't you? He growled, his voice laced with venom. You're wasting your time. Shut up, Sarah snapped, scanning the edge of the forest nervously. She knew Jamal could handle himself, but something about Stephen's smug expression made her uneasy. You have no idea what's out there. Stephen added, his tone almost gleeful. You're going to regret this. Sarah glared at him, but her focus quickly returned to the woods. She could still hear Jamal's faint shouts, but the forest had swallowed him, and she knew she wouldn't be able to help if something went wrong. Jamal pressed on his flashlight, cutting through the oppressive darkness. The whimpers grew louder, guiding him deeper into the woods, but the unsettling feeling that he was being followed refused to leave him. He paused, his ears straining for any sound beyond Emily's cries. A twig snapped behind him. Jamal whirled around, his flashlight sweeping through the trees. The beam caught nothing but shadows and swaying branches. His hand instinctively moved to the holster at his side, but he didn't draw his weapon. Not yet. Emily, it's okay, he said, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. I'm here. I'll keep you safe. Another sound of rustling, this time from his left. He pivoted again, his flashlight landing on a cluster of trees. For a split second, he thought he saw movement, a shadow slipping between the trunks. His grip on the flashlight tightened, his pulse quickening. Whoever was out here wasn't just watching, They were circling. "Who's there?" Jamal demanded, his voice firm. "Show yourself." Silence. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the usual symphony of nocturnal life eerily absent. Jamal took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help him. Or Emily. He moved Caudy, I-L-Y, toward the sound of her cries, now more distinct. "Emily, I'm close, just hold on," he called. Finally, he spotted a small clearing ahead, the faintest outline of a figure crouched near the base of a tree. Emily, relief flooded through him as he quickened his pace. But his elation was short-lived. A heavy footfall sounded directly behind him, followed by the unmistakable metallic click of a knife being unsheathed. Jamal turned just in time to see the blade glinting in the faint light of his flashlight. A man stepped out of the shadows, his face obscured by a dark hoodie, his posture low and predatory. This wasn't a random bystander. This was Stephen Blake's accomplice. "Stay back," Jamal ordered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He shifted his stance, angling his body to shield Emily, who was still huddled near the tree. The man didn't respond. He lunged, the knife flashing toward Jamal's chest. Jamal dodged, the blade slicing through the air inches from his shoulder. He swung his flashlight like a baton, striking the man's wrist. The knife clattered to the ground, but the attacker was relentless, shoving Jamal backward into a tree. Pain shot through Jamal's back as he collided with the rough bark, but he stayed on his feet. He grabbed the man's arm, twisting it behind his back in a practiced motion. The man snarled, slamming his elbow into Jamal's ribs. The blow knocked the wind out of him, but he didn't let go. "Run, Emily," Jamal shouted, his voice strained. "Go now." The girl hesitated, her wide eyes darting between Jamal and the fight unfolding in front of her. "Go," he repeated, his tone desperate. Emily scrambled to her feet, clutching her doll tightly. As she darted into the thicker part of the woods, Jal let out a breath of relief, but had no time to dwell on it. The man twisted free of his grip, his hands clawing for the knife on the ground. Jamal kicked it out of reach.